Hello and welcome back, and that's right, we're going to continue talking about SSDs today, and today we're talking about the MSI Spatium, that one. It's the M480. Now, this is an SSD that I talked about around about a month and a half ago when it was first properly and formally revealed by MSI. MSI, a big name in the world of gaming and motherboards and basically PC communities, are now turning their hands to their own storage media. It's not the first SSD they've ever really been involved in, but this, I think, is one of the most high profile. Also, because it's not only an SSD that is big possibilities behind it for PC gamers, but also, of course, PS5 gamers as well. Something we talk about here on the channel quite a lot this year, 2021. So we've got the 1TB version today. We're going to talk a little bit about the specifications, talk about the things that I like, things that I'm less keen on about it, and of course getting it on the test machine where we're going to run it on Autodisk Benchmark, AS SSD, and talking about Crystal Disk and stuff like that, and of course AJA, and getting some performance figures out of this SSD. But we talked about a lot of SSDs recently, and it has to be said that although we have seen an enormous splurge of high-performance SSDs in the last, well, I would say 6 months, the last 2 months have seen an absolute deluge of very similar SSDs. And the things they have in common is they're all PCIe Gen 4x4, they are all utilising the Phison E18 controller, and they are all taking advantage of NVMe revision 1.4. Now this is no exception, yet somehow all of these brands, from your Sabrents to your Corsairs to your Seagates and more, although they've got the same architecture behind them, they've all got different performance figures and endurance and IOPS and stuff like that. So how can the same building blocks of an SSD from so many brands be producing such wildly differing spec sheets? And that's another thing we're going to talk about in this video. But when I first mentioned this SSD, the reason I brought it up more than anything is it was announced formally at roughly the same time as the FireCuda 530, yet arrived at an arguably more affordable price point and performance benchmarks that were very similar. To put it into perspective, this drive knocks around in 3 main capacities: 500 gig, 1TB and 2TB, arriving at £89, give or take, £165, give or take, and guess what? £329, give or take, you know, relative to those capacities. And that's already quite impressive price difference. That's at the 2TB mark, that's about 100 nicker cheaper in some places than that FireCuda. Now, it does arrive with that Phison E18 controller. It's got 96 layer Micron NAND, so 96 layer 3D TLC NAND. So you've got your triple layer NAND there, and you know, not too shabby in terms of the NAND production there at 96 layers. Now, the majority of brands in the PCIe Gen 4 M.2 NVMe SSD kind of spectrum right now that are dropping their releases at you are all using 96 layer. There's only 2 or 3 exceptions, like the crucial P5 Plus and of course the FireCuda, which have ramped things up to 176 layer NAND. So we're not going to judge this harshly just because it doesn't reach those enormous triple digit figures of NAND complexity, particularly when it's matching a lot of the others that are out there. Now if we have a look at the SSD without me dropping it on the table like a tit, it's a single-sided 1TB SSD there, as you can see. Get that there in front of you. With DDR4 SD-RAM memory, and that memory again for the 500 gig, it arrives with 512 megabytes of DDR4, and then 1 gigabyte and 2 gigabytes of DDR4 on the 1TB and the 2TB respectively there. And of course, as mentioned, it does take advantage of NVMe revision 1.4, the latest revision in terms of storage capabilities of these drives. So again, they've eked out as much as they can. And being PCIe Gen 4, one of the interesting things with all of these drives is just how much of that bandwidth of PCIe Gen 4 can this saturate in read and write. But to let you know, PCIe Gen 4 that would be 2000 megabytes per second throughput, and then with the times, in this case times 4, you got your 2000 times 4, 8000 megabytes per second bandwidth here. That is your pipe. Let's see just how much water this thing can push through the pipe, because they report that at the 500 gig, it's 6500 megabytes per second sequential read, and an arguably less impressive 2850 megabytes per second write. Now, all of the 500 gig models across all of the brands, their write speeds are pretty bad compared to that read. And again, these aren't real world, these are sequential data, so big chunky data. None of the individual files going very, very quickly, that's 4K. With these 2850 megabytes per second sequential write at the 500 gig, yes, relative to other 500 gigs, it's, you know, they're all quite low, but 2800 is one of the lowest performing sequential write 500 gig PCIe Gen 4 M.2 NVMe SSDs that I have seen so far in all of my testing. Luckily, we're testing the 1 TB, but I did think it was worth highlighting that the 1 TB really did seem to dip below the others, some of which, you know, they're getting to like 3000, 3001. I think WD and Samsung were doing much better in this sequential read on the sequential write at the 500 gig model, but the 1 TBs, you've got a respectable 7000 megabytes per second sequential read and 5500 megabytes per second sequential write, and at the 2 TB, a real lovely 7000 read and 6850 sequential write. So again, they really make it up at the bigger capacities. And with the smaller capacity, although the write is pretty, you know, it's not great, and it doesn't even hit 7000 at the 500 gig. Remember, that drive knocks around for about 80, 90 quid. So it's actually quite affordable compared to the others, and it's coming from a brand that makes motherboards. And if we carefully try to get that label off of there, because we want to reapply that label in a bit, we can have a little look at the controllers inside and that NAND. So having a look there, let's bring that to camera. You can just about make out that big old chip there at the top. That is that Phison E18 controller, the one that everybody's using at the moment. It's weird that Phison themselves don't have their own SSD range, but they make this controller and everyone's like, give it, give it, give it, give it, give it. Obviously, WD, Samsung, Crucial, these brands, they use their own in-house controllers, and they do a very, very good job of it, it has to be said. But Phison at the moment is supplying, it's got to be 10, 20, 30, 50 different brands in one shape or form, and a myriad of controllers in the last year or two from the E14, E16, and E18. Now, underneath, we have got that area of memory. We've got the 1 gig of memory there at the base, and then all the way along, we've got those individual NAND components there for the whole storage underneath there. And as mentioned, the back, it's a bare PCB there. This is a single-sided module, something a lot of people are going to be happy about. Because if you're installing this in compact shuttle cases where your heatsink is going to have to be quite compact, or if you're going to be utilizing this for a PS5, and we've already done the PS5 testing for this, I don't know if that's gone live yet, but because it's single-sided, it means you don't need a big chunk, you don't need to provision too much of the heatsink space internally, and you can get a much fatter heatsink for the top and not worry too much about the bottom, maybe a light thermal pad there. But for all the good that we talk about with this device, it's worth highlighting there is some slightly meh stuff compared to the other brands out there. For a start, the heatsink is optional, and I've mentioned this in other videos before. You don't need strictly to get a first-party heatsink. You know, you can get some decent heat sinks out there for about 10, 12 quid. You know, they're quite easy to find. But first-party heat sinks, if you can get one, because the thermal padding and the way it's applied at factory in airtight conditions and stuff, you get a better kind of application of the heatsink. And, you know, that's a great thing to have. But given that optional heatsinks generally divide the price quite notably, it can be, you know, very difficult. And I quite like brands like the Corsair. There we go. I think this review may already be live. But the Corsair MP600 Pro, that SSD has a heatsink already pre-included. You can't get it without the heatsink, and it's still provisioned and priced quite well. So, although I like that there's an optional manufacturer heatsink, it's a real shame they didn't just bundle it in, particularly because it's coming from MSI, who I thought would be a little bit more brand aware on a subject like that. But one of the things that, again, I'm slightly underwhelmed by is the IOPS on this. Now, the IOPS, again, I'm sure they've already been on screen, but let's highlight them. At the 500 gig, it's 170K over 600K. And then at the 1 TB, it's 350K over 700K. And finally, at the top end, 650K over 700K. Respectable numbers, completely respectable numbers. But there's a lot of SSDs and PCIe Gen 4 that could do a better and higher IOP reported rating than this drive. And it is cheaper than a number of drives out there, but it's not that much cheaper. And although the sequential read-write, that big data access at the 1 TB and the 2 TB are pretty impressive, IOPS are where we're talking about smaller file access, the ones that are going to cause a big old delay there in the background, something I think PC gamers are going to feel more, and video editors and people that deal with lots of template files. Those are the users that are going to look at those IOPS figures and be a little bit underwhelmed there. When we do the testing on this, we are going to be testing this on that 6-core 11th Gen i5 system, 16 gig of memory, no GPU card, with the drive being used as a secondary, not a primary drive. So this SSD should be fine for that setup, but I do think those with a beefier setup are going to find IOP figures like that a little bit of a bottleneck there moving forward. In terms of endurance, it's kind of a mixed bag. It arrives at 1.6 million hours MTBF. No one really cares about MTBF these days. They want to know about terabytes written and drive writes per day. Me personally, I always prioritize and like to look at drive writes per day. It's a more universal figure. For those that aren't aware, terabytes written is when you how many terabytes can be written to this drive within its warranty period, which in this case is 5 years. This is how long the brand, in this case MSI, are prepared to certify that this drive will work at its optimal. Now that's great, but of course terabytes written scales per drive, 500 gig, 1 TB and 2 TB, it scales up and it makes it very hard to track. Whereas drive writes per day is a universal figure across all of them. So DWPD means what percentage, or in this case a decimal place of a drive, can you apply data every single day on this drive and it still work within optimal efficiency within 5 years. And in this case, this drive is rated at 0.38 drive writes per day, which is very respectable. I would say more than 80% of the drives that I've looked at have that rating. I think the only exceptions to that rule, again, are drives like the Crucial, the Samsung and the WD, which have, I believe, 0.3 drive writes per day. And I think the Sabrent Q4, quite a measly 0.1. That means if it was a 1 TB drive, you can't write more than 100 gig a day to that drive within that 5-year period without coming outside of that zone of knowing that the performance benchmarks are certified to last that long. But 0.38 is very respectable. The majority of the Phison E18 drives I've seen arrive with it, and again the FireCuda, much more expensive, has a 0.7 drive writes per day, massively higher than everyone else at the moment. And I've not seen a single drive touch that durability and performance and IOPS as well. It's still the king of the kings right now as far as the drives go, and it's priced accordingly. But again, as I mentioned, 5-year warranty on this drive. Again, you know, you're getting a very good drive, but if this had been released 6 months before, I reckon it would be a lot more popular and stand out a lot more than it does at the moment. It's suffering a little bit of the market kind of understanding and kind of acceptance that the FireCuda is having. If the FireCuda or this had arrived 6 months ago, when the WD Black SN850 and the Samsung 980 Pro were in their pomp, when they just arrived and they were basically killing it because there was no one out there challenging their performance and their price point, if these drives came along before the market became arguably a bit more saturated with PCIe Gen 4 drives, I think this would stand out a lot more. But let's see if it really does stand out in the testing. Let's get this drive in the test machine, and let's see what those performance benchmarks are for this drive in my system. Let's go. Right, so here we are on the test machine. As you see here, as mentioned, we are utilising an 11th Gen i5 processor there with 16 gig of memory on this Windows 10 Pro system. We've already added the MSI M480 1TB drive. We've got a lovely little 26C temperature mark there. That is going to go up noticeably. We're utilising a big old heatsink on this SSD as well. I'm utilising the Sabrent heatsink that we've used previously. So it's a big chunky number down there. And I have already equipped the drive in our system. We've mounted it as M drive here, so once again it's not the OS drive that we're utilizing, and we're going to be taking advantage of lots of software today. So let's go through some of the options that we're going to be going through. We're of course going to be looking at Atto Disk Benchmark, where we are going to be looking at this drive. We're also going to be taking advantage of AJA at one point there, but slightly different of course. And we're going to be taking advantage of Crystal Disk, which is going to be one of our heftier tests while we test the sequential read-write as well as mixed, and AS SSD as well. All of those tests throughout this video. It is worth mentioning as well that we are taking advantage of OBS, which is a bit of a problem. If you've watched my other reviews, you'll know that using OBS can be problematic, as it does affect the read-write results. I could use an external capture card like I've done with the PS5 recordings, but I'm in a completely different recording environment here, and it makes it very, very tough. So what I do generally is I show you guys the setup, perform the test, because they're very slow, very dull, and they do go on for about 20 plus minutes, and then I come back and go through the results with you. To give you a case in point example, if we try to run a test on the MSI now, look at the performance benchmarks we're getting, they're terrible, and that's because we are taking advantage of the PC, and we're using OBS, which does affect the hardware at the same time as doing a benchmark, so we can't run them both simultaneously there. So what I'm going to do is run through all of my tests. Be interesting to see. The temperature has already leapt up a little bit there on that little test that I was running, even though it was a small test using AJA, but it was quite a consistent test. But what I'm going to do now is perform all of the different tests on different file sizes and go through the results with you shortly. For me, it's going to be 20-30 minutes. For you, mere seconds. Let's go. Okay, so testing has concluded. We've run all of our tests and I can't wait to go through them with you. But before we go any further, let's make sure we stay relative. On the left-hand side of the screen here, these are the official specifications from MSI themselves. And remember, we are looking at the 1 terabyte model here. As you can see, running down this pile there, suggesting that it is 7,000 megabytes per second maximum sequential read, 5,500 maximum sequential write, and 350,000 4K IOPS, and 700,000 4K IOPS in write. So that's what we are dealing with here. So we're going to come back to that a couple of times, I think, all the way through these tests. I hate seagulls, but let's carry on. So first test I want to look at here, as mentioned, is Crystal Disk. And I'm pleased to say Crystal Disk, for the most part, lived up to what we wanted. We can see there that it didn't actually at any point crack 7,000. Remember, their reported maximum was 7,000 there, but I will highlight that it got pretty darn close with the large, and remember, it was a sequential file, so in other words, big data. So obviously the biggest one of the three got the high score, and you know, that's still not terrible. That's really, really close to 7,000 there, but I would be quick to highlight that the Spatium, sorry, not the Spatium, the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus and the FireCuda 530 both promoted 7,000 megs and both hit 7,000 megs on this test rig. So although it's incredibly close that it would be pedantic beyond measure to penalise them for it, I do think it's worth highlighting that those other two SSDs on this same system were able to crack 7,000 there. Now, if we have a look at the rest, sequential write there, you know, getting incredibly close once again and exceeding 5,500. Once again, that was reported at the maximum there at 5,500, so it did crack it. So I think for the most part that's okay. IOPS there, 4K random, you know, middling there, 4 to 5. I think it dipped at one point at 350. And again, if we go back to it, they did suggest 350 and 700 respectively. So I think, again, maybe less so. The IOPS on this aren't quite as good as I might like. But again, all these stats still stand out pretty well for me. If I come out of it there, and from here we make our way into Atto Disk Benchmark. And in the Atto Disk Benchmark tests, let's get rid of that score there. We can see that the write there was a little middling. It was getting close to 5 in the write, and it cracked it a few times, but we never saw that fantastic read there hitting 7. Write got incredibly close and only vaguely exceeded that 5 as mentioned, but it never really cracked high. I think the highest report there was 6,300 megabits per second, or 6.3 gigabits there. If we look through all of them, I think that is basically the best we're dealing with there. 631 even there. We had some 630s there. but again, nothing close to the 7000 or 7 gigabit that might have been suggested this drive can do. And if we flick over to the IOPS, they're a little tougher to read because obviously we're not using the tiny 4K measure here. We're not using the tiniest, so these aren't going to be relative much. But the IOPS there for the bigger files are still worth looking at, and they're not too shabby, but again, they are relative to what we've seen previously there on those reported IOPS at 4K, so it's very hard to read those in particular comparative form. From there, we make our way into AS SSD disk benchmark. Bit of an odd one this. Every time we run AS, it's, I would say, more indicative of real-world use generally, and whenever we see AS disk benchmark on the back of the likes of Atto and Crystal Disk, it always looks like it's being quite tough on it, and I have said that before. But relative to itself, I do think it does stand up, and these do seem to indicate quite similar use, although I will say, at the 1 gig level, the write there did dip noticeably lower than the others, although read was fairly consistent between them. During the testing, I should add, 1 minute of pause between every test, so I left 1 minute every time we did a pause to let the temperature go down, and the temperature was all right, but I will say that it did get hot real quick, even in the Sabrent NVMe SSD heatsink that we are utilising for the test today, but still pretty good sums there. And again, we can flick into the IOPS for each of them, but again, these are IOPS that are relative to the larger file types and not the 4K that we've seen on their own suggested benchmarks. Finally, we can make our way into AJA. Now, AJA, as mentioned, is a bit of a different kettle of fish. It has to be said, it's quite hard to maintain these. Don't look at the big numbers much, if I'm honest, because 1 gig of test file is going to basically completely oversaturate the memory, that SD RAM inside. So we're not looking at that. What we're looking at is the charts at the bottom. So again, we've got 1 gig here, and we are looking at the charts at the just underneath them there, because that is the important detail here, what these charts are showing. As we can see, at peak, we were hitting there 5,800 at writes, which again, this is in reverse with AJA because it's working with the system. So even though it says write, we have to read, actually interpret this as read. And we're hitting that 5,800 pretty well, getting close to 6. But again, we never broke into 7 here during the testing. And I know AJA is in a slightly unfair way to benchmark these drives at 1, 4, and 16 gig file size. But as you can see there, the oversaturation of that memory did prove slightly troublesome during the testing. But nonetheless, I think the Spatium, arguably, of all the tests that I've performed previously, is not quite as high as some of the other drives that I've tested previous. Now, whether that is because of the drive itself and the NAND they're utilising, maybe not being as good as some of the others, we're using 176 layer. But even then, the majority of drives right now are using 96 layer micron memory. And I kind of thought this drive would break that 7,000 mark a lot more than we saw it. And I think the real tell for me was in the second and third test stages there, particularly Atto, where it did seem a marked regard lower than I would have liked in terms of throughput there at traditional read-write. It's a good SSD, and you know, MSI should be proud of themselves, but nonetheless, there are a lot of drives out there at the moment, and I feel like this drive would have fared a lot better in the market than it currently does with so much competition right now, and therefore its unique selling point maybe not appearing so unique compared to others. But nonetheless, this has been my review of the MSI Spatium, however you want to pronounce it. Bung it in the comments, M480. If you've enjoyed this, do click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. We're testing lots and lots and lots of PCIe Gen 4 M.2 NVMe SSDs in the next few weeks, so do check those out. And of course, take advantage of the free advice section in the link to in the comments, along with links to all of the products we talked about today to NAS Compares. We talk about this subject a lot. We give out free advice. Why not take advantage of it? I will see you next time.